But what is the best way to deal with Iran and its nuclear ambitions? Will Israel's ultimatum do more harm than good? Joining me now in Toronto is Toronto Star columnist Haroon Siddiqui. And in Washington, hi, is Mark Dubowitz from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Anna.
Our pleasure.
The Israeli Prime Minister went to the UN to make a plea for a strike against Iran. Netanyahu has a strong ally in Prime Minister Harper, yet all Harper would say today was, we want to see a peaceful resolution of all of this, and we will work closely with our allies. That's a quote. Now, Haroon Siddiqui, what do you make of the messaging coming out of the UN this week?
Well, the first thing to be said from a Canadian point of view is that the Prime Minister chose not to address the United Nations and attend a meeting with Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Abbas separately. It seemed like a calculated snub to the United Nations, which is not a good thing for a Canadian Prime Minister to do. That's the first thing. The second part of your question, vis-a-vis the recent closing of the Canadian embassy in Tehran, the general reaction from experts and so on, with whom I agree, is that it was not the right thing to do. Because if, in fact, Iran is as bad as Mr. Harper and everyone thinks it is, all the more reason to keep the channels of communication open. And John Mundy, the last Canadian Prime Minister we had in Iran, said, we never closed the doors and never closed our embassy in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet regime was far worse than the current Iranian regime would ever be.
But what does it really mean to close the doors if they're not really talking?
No, but you see, you never know when you need to talk. If, in fact, that is the attitude, we would be closing our embassy in half of the world because we don't want to deal with them. Or we don't agree with them, which is not the case. The whole point of diplomacy is to keep the doors open in case the opportunity arises that we need to talk to them, or that Canada could play a role in between Israel and the United States and Iran in that triangle. You never know those things.
Right. Mark Dubowitz, what's your take on how close Iran is to making a bomb?
Well, it's not my take. It's the take of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has made it pretty clear that the Iranians are very close to nuclear capacity, where they'll have everything in place that once they make a political decision, they could either break out or sneak out and develop a bomb. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu went to the UN not to call for military strikes against Iran. I think quite the opposite. I think he made it very clear that setting a red line would make it more likely that sanctions and diplomacy would work and that there would be less of a need for a military strike. And I think his diagram was quite instructive for lots of folks who follow this issue and lots of folks who don't, in explaining exactly how close the Iranians are to developing a nuclear weapon, or at least having highly enriched uranium that will help them achieve that objective. And I would just add one other thing, Mr. Siddiqui. The reason that Iranian diplomats were thrown out of Ottawa is because they're not diplomats. They're intelligence agents who are running sophisticated procurement networks, who are using the Iranian embassy to spy on Iranian dissidents and to intimidate them, and are involved in intelligence operations in Canada. The reason Canadian diplomats were pulled from Tehran is because your government feared for their safety, and quite rightly so, given the fact that this Iranian regime has never respected the sovereignty of any embassy in any nation. So I think it was a wise decision of the Canadian government, and I think it's in the best interests of its diplomats and its national security.
Is this news that foreign diplomats spy? I mean, do Americans not spy? Do Israelis not spy? I mean, all of people do. This is normal course.
Yeah,
so
Mr.
this
Siddiqui,
is just a good excuse
I think
to
that's
do
an
what we have done.
Yeah, I think that's an absurd moral equivalence to suggest that the United States and Israel spies. This is an Iranian regime that brutalizes its own people, and that's using its embassy in Canada to spy on Iranian dissidents and to intimidate them, and has used embassies around the world to actually kill Iranian dissidents. So I think that it's a moral equivalence that I think clearly is not very compelling for viewers out there when you compare the Iranian regime to the United States, Israel, or Canada. So I think this was a wise decision
by this government. There's no moral equivalency, just a statement of fact, but you're entitled to your view. That's one view.
Subjective view.
Mr. Siddiqui, I want to ask you as well, how close do you believe Iran is to building a bomb?
Oh, how would I know? How would you know? How does anyone know? I mean, Israel did not know, for example, where the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was being held across the border in Gaza for so many years. How can we possibly know what exactly is going on in Iran? These are matters of speculation. And Mark says rightly so that the International Atomic Energy Agency has issued a report. That report, however, does not say that they are close to making a bomb, that they are out to do so tomorrow. The American intelligence does not believe that they are close. We should hear what President Obama had to say to the United Nations. We believe there is still time for sanctions to work. There's still time that diplomacy be given a chance. And President Obama, as well as Mr. Harper, has refused to draw the red line that Mr. Netanyahu wanted.
How much time?
So there is your answer.
How much time?
Who knows how much time? I mean, I don't run an intelligence service. The Americans do. They have a notion of how much time they have. I would like to believe the President of the United States when he believes, and in fact he's a president who has drawn a very hard line. He is the one, unlike George W. Bush, who corralled the European Union, corralled China, corralled Russia into a united front and very strict sanctions on Iran. And he believes, and the world, most of the world believes, that the sanctions are beginning to bite Iran. So there's no need to either rush to war or to indulge in more jingoism at this point.
Now, Mark Dubowitz, we just spoke with Minister of Defense Peter MacKay, who said sanctions against Iran are starting to make a bite. But is there time for diplomacy and sanctions to work before Iran has the ability to make a nuclear device, in your opinion?
Yeah, Hannah, you know, it's a difficult question, but Mr. Siddiqui is wrong. This is not a question of having an intelligence agency. This is a question of reading multiple IEA reports that have made it very clear that this is about Iranian nuclear physics and Western economic pressure. And with Iranian nuclear physics, we have a pretty good idea of how many centrifuges are spinning, how much in uranium is being enriched, whether the Iranians are working on a nuclear trigger, whether they're weaponizing. The IAEA report has been pretty clear that they are actually taking great strides in order to develop nuclear weapons capacity. Now, whether they make that decision to sneak out or break out and develop a bomb is a matter of question and speculation, but we certainly know they're developing the ability to do so. With respect to sanctions, the real question is not whether sanctions are hurting the Iranian economy. It's clear they are. The question is, will sanctions cause an economic collapse? Will there be such a severe economic collapse that it'll change the risk-reward calculus of Ali Khamenei and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? Because without an economic collapse, there is clear evidence that this regime will not compromise at the negotiating table. We don't know how far that economic cripple date is. It's not enough to say oil revenues are dropping, that inflation is increasing, that the currency is plummeting. We need to know how far away that economic cripple date is. And if it's too far away and it's too far from the economic or the nuclear threshold date, sanctions won't have time to work. I think everybody's in agreement we need a peaceful solution, but I think we don't want to have rose-colored glasses on in believing that ultimately sanctions are going to solve this problem. It may take military force, and I think the President of the United States has made it very clear that he's willing to use military force as a last option.
And Mr.
Right, and the President of the United States has also made clear that there is time.
Now, Mr. Siddiqui, I just want to ask you really quickly, we don't have a lot of time, but forgive the use of the words, but what is the potential fallout if Israel does go ahead with some sort of preventative strike?
No, you see, because you don't have to listen to me. Listen to the Canadian Nobel laureate John Polanyi, who said the other day that besides the arguments over how close they are or how close they are not, and whether or not a nuclear strike will indeed destroy the nuclear technology of Iran or merely postpone it, he raised another political point which is very valid. Is following the Iraq war, following the war in Afghanistan, we now have the following political prospect. Two nuclear states, namely the United States and Israel, are going to be bombing an Islamic nation to be, in effect, starting a third war on a Muslim nation at a time when the President of the United States has made it a policy to mend fences with the Arab and Muslim world. This is not to say that we should roll over and play dead. It's a matter of tactics. It's a matter of geopolitical strategy. And at this time, the action that the President of the United States has taken, and in fact, something that Mr. Harper half agreed on, is the right and prudent course at this time.
Thank you, Haroon Siddiqui and Mark Dubowitz. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Hannah.